The skin on Bjorn Eriksson's feet had turned black and would never feel warmth again. In January 1342, temperatures in northern Norway dropped to -42 degrees Fahrenheit, and this 17-year-old peasant had just spent 14 straight hours buried naked under a pile of his family's bodies inside a single-room hut that measured 8 feet by 12 feet. His father's corpse pressed against his back, his mother's frozen breath created ice crystals on his neck, and his 3 younger siblings lay motionless on top of him, their combined body weight crushing his ribs. But Bjorn was alive, and in 3 months, when the snow finally melted, he would walk out of that death trap missing 2 toes and most of his left foot, carrying the only other survivor, his 4-year-old sister Astrid, on his back. This was warfare against nature itself, fought by people who owned nothing except the knowledge passed down through 30 generations of peasants who had learned to cheat death when the world tried to freeze them solid. These weren't the Vikings you see in movies with their longships and raids. These were the ones who stayed behind, the farmers and fishermen who had to survive months when the sun disappeared completely and temperatures dropped so low that spit froze before it hit the ground. How did human beings survive in conditions that would kill a modern person wearing the best winter gear money can buy? How did families with no heat source except their own bodies make it through nights that lasted 20 hours in places where the cold could kill you in minutes? The answer starts with a practice so disturbing that modern people can barely comprehend it. But for Viking peasants, it meant the difference between life and death. When the first killing frost arrived in October, entire families would strip completely naked and pile together like animals, creating what they called the warmth mound. The biggest person, usually the father, would lie on the bottom. Then the mother, then the children from largest to smallest, with babies placed directly against the adults' bare chests where their hearts could keep the smallest bodies warm. It was what happened when someone died during the night. Viking peasants discovered that a dead body holds heat for almost 6 hours after the heart stops beating. So when a family member died from cold or hunger during those endless winter nights, the survivors wouldn't remove the corpse. They would keep it pressed against them until the body went completely cold, extracting every last degree of warmth from their dead loved ones. Astrid Magnusdottir, a peasant woman from the Orkney Islands, wrote in 1356 about sleeping with her dead husband's body for 3 nights straight during a blizzard that lasted 9 days. She described how his skin turned grey, then blue, then finally black, but she couldn't afford to lose the heat his corpse still contained. When she finally pushed his frozen body away on the 4th morning, the outline of his torso was burned into her memory forever, but she had survived another night. Viking peasants had mapped the human body's heat zones with the accuracy of modern thermal imaging. They knew that the chest generated the most consistent warmth, that the armpits and groin produced intense but brief heat, and that the feet and hands would sacrifice themselves first to keep the vital organs alive. They positioned family members accordingly, treating each person's body like a piece of equipment in a survival machine. The person in the middle of the pile, usually a pregnant woman or the sickest family member, would stay in that position all night, but everyone else moved in careful patterns that had been practiced during warmer months. Parents knew exactly how to shift their weight without waking the children, how to breathe in ways that maximized the warmth of their exhaled air, and how to position their hands to keep blood flowing to their extremities. A family of 6 adults could keep each other alive for up to 18 hours in temperatures as low as -30 degrees Fahrenheit, but add just one more person to the pile, and the weight would crush the people on the bottom, cutting off circulation and causing death within 12 hours. Remove one person, and the heat loss would kill the remaining 5 within 14 hours. Viking peasants knew these numbers because they had tested them with their own lives for generations. The extra body heat generated by pregnancy could help keep a family alive, but the baby growing inside would demand more calories and warmth than the mother could spare. Historical records from Iceland show that during the winter of 1348, 63% of pregnant women died from cold and starvation, but their unborn children provided enough extra body heat to save their families. The women knew this when they made the decision to get pregnant during harvest season. Viking peasants discovered that raw fat from seals, whales, or pigs would generate more body heat than cooked meat, so they would eat pounds of pure animal fat during the coldest months. A typical peasant would consume up to 8,000 calories per day during winter, with 70% of those calories coming from pure fat. Their stomachs would distend like balloons, and many would vomit from the sheer volume of grease, but the fat would burn inside their bodies like fuel in a furnace. Fresh human urine maintains a temperature of 98 degrees for almost 20 minutes after leaving the body. Viking peasants would urinate into animal bladders or clay pots, then press these containers against their chests and stomachs, rotating them among family members to share the warmth. Children were taught to control their bladders so they could urinate on command when someone was close to freezing to death. When frostbite began setting in, Viking peasants would use knives heated in fires to cut away the frozen flesh before the damage spread. They performed these amputations on themselves and their family members without any painkillers except alcohol, which was too precious to waste on pain relief. Historical records describe peasants cutting off their own fingers, toes, and even hands to prevent gangrene from killing them. His wife cauterized the wound by pressing a red-hot iron rod against the stump while their 3 children held him down. Olaf lived for another 22 years, but he had to crawl everywhere he went for the rest of his life. He considered this a victory because all 4 of his family members survived that winter. Their core body temperatures would drop to 94 degrees and stay there for months, slowing their heart rates to 40 beats per minute and allowing them to survive on half the calories that would normally keep a person alive. Their hands and feet would turn blue-black from November through March, and many lost all feeling in their extremities, but they would still be able to work, eat, and care for their families. Women would give birth with completely numb hands, unable to feel their own babies, but they had trained themselves to deliver children by touch and instinct alone. They discovered that sleeping longer than 4 hours at a time in extreme cold would slow their metabolism so much that they might never wake up. So they developed a system of rotating sleep shifts, with one family member staying awake at all times to monitor everyone else's breathing and shake awake anyone whose body temperature dropped too low. The person on watch duty would spend their time doing jumping jacks, push-ups, and other exercises to generate heat, then pass this warmth to the sleeping family members by pressing their heated body against the sleepers. This meant that during a typical winter night, each person would only sleep 2 to 3 hours at a time. But the constant motion and shared body heat kept everyone alive. Viking peasants developed a psychological technique they called warm memory, where they would spend hours each day recalling in perfect detail the feeling of summer sunshine on their skin. They would describe these memories out loud to each other, creating shared fantasies of warmth that helped them endure the reality of freezing. Children were taught to memorize the exact sensation of warm water, hot food, and sun-heated rocks, then practice calling up these memories during the coldest moments. Adults who mastered this technique reported feeling genuinely warmer, even though their body temperatures remained dangerously low. Modern psychology would recognize this as a form of self-hypnosis, but for Viking peasants, it was simply another tool for staying alive. The social structure of survival meant that the strongest and most experienced family members would sacrifice themselves first to save the children and pregnant women. Grandfathers and older men would deliberately expose themselves to the worst cold, volunteer for the most dangerous tasks, like gathering firewood during blizzards, and give up their portions of food when supplies ran low. This wasn't nobility or heroism. This was calculated strategy, based on who had the best chance of surviving until spring. The older men had systematically killed themselves through exposure and malnutrition to give the younger generation enough resources to live. Families planned these sacrifices months in advance, with grandfathers teaching their sons exactly how to manage the family's survival after the old men died. The dying process itself became part of the survival strategy. When a family member was clearly going to die from cold or hunger, they would position themselves to provide maximum benefit to the survivors. Dying people would lie in the center of the warmth pile, using their last hours of body heat to keep everyone else alive. They would consume any remaining medicine or alcohol, then vomit it up for others to consume, passing along nutrients their own bodies could no longer process. Clothing wasn't worn the way modern people understand clothing. Viking peasants would strip naked and wrap themselves together in a single massive fur that covered the entire family. These communal wrappings were made from the skins of bears, seals, or wolves, and they measured up to 12 feet by 16 feet. The fur would be positioned so that the animals' heads covered the humans' heads, and the paws would be tied around the family's feet. But here's what made this technique so effective. The animal skins were never cleaned or treated. They retained the original animal's scent, body oils, and even some tissue, which continued to generate small amounts of heat through decomposition. A fresh bear skin could provide extra warmth for up to 6 weeks after the bear's death, giving families a crucial advantage during the coldest part of winter. All water sources would freeze solid from December through March, so Viking peasants had to get their liquid from melting snow and ice inside their mouths. But they discovered that swallowing ice-cold water would lower their core body temperature so quickly that it could trigger cardiac arrest. So they developed a technique of holding snow in their mouths for exactly 3 minutes, letting their body heat melt it slowly, then swallowing the water only after it reached near body temperature. This process had to be repeated dozens of times per day to prevent dehydration, and families would take turns warming snow in their mouths, then spitting the heated water into containers for others to drink. Children who were too young to warm snow properly would drink water that had been heated in their parents' mouths, a practice that spread diseases but kept the children from dying of thirst. The most successful Viking peasant families developed something historians call winter personalities, completely different ways of thinking and behaving that emerged only during the coldest months. People who were normally generous and kind would become coldly calculating, making decisions about food and warmth based purely on mathematics rather than emotions. Parents would watch their children suffer without showing any outward signs of distress, because emotional reactions used energy that could mean the difference between life and death. They were learned behaviors passed down through generations, ways of thinking that helped families make the brutal decisions necessary for survival. A mother might calmly decide to let her weakest child die in order to save her 3 stronger children, then return to normal motherly behavior when spring arrived. Viking peasants who had spent months sleeping naked in piles, eating raw fat, and drinking each other's heated saliva would suddenly have to return to regular social behavior. Many couldn't make this adjustment. Historical records describe spring madness, where survivors would continue winter survival behaviors long after they were necessary, unable to trust that the warm weather would last. Some families would refuse to sleep in separate beds even during summer, continuing to pile together naked out of fear that winter would return unexpectedly. Others would hoard fat and refuse to eat cooked food, their bodies and minds permanently altered by months of survival mode thinking. Children who survived multiple brutal winters often never developed normal emotional responses to cold, hunger, or physical discomfort. Viking peasants who survived into old age carried scars and damage from decades of extreme cold exposure. Their joints would be permanently damaged from months of compressed sleeping. Their digestive systems would be ruined from eating raw fat and rotting meat, and their extremities would be covered in amputation scars and frostbite damage. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Viking peasant survival wasn't the techniques they used or the sacrifices they made. It was how completely they had accepted that survival required them to stop being fully human for months at a time. They understood that civilization was a luxury they couldn't afford when temperatures dropped below zero, and they had developed systematic ways to abandon human dignity, privacy, and individual identity in order to keep their families alive. Modern people struggle to survive a single night without heating when the power goes out. Viking peasants designed their entire lives around surviving months of conditions that would kill most modern humans within hours. They didn't see this as heroic or extraordinary. For them, it was simply what people did when winter came and the choice was between survival and death. They were sophisticated survival systems developed over centuries by people who understood that nature didn't care about human dignity, comfort, or individual survival. Every method they used from sleeping with corpses to eating raw fat to amputating their own limbs, was based on careful observation and testing that had been refined through generations of trial and error. When the last of the traditional Viking peasant communities disappeared in the late 1400s, they took with them knowledge of human survival that no modern person possesses. They had learned to push the human body and mind to limits that we can barely imagine, and they had created social systems that allowed families to make impossible choices and still function as loving communities when the crisis passed. The 17-year-old Bjorn Eriksson, who crawled out of that death pile in 1342, lived for another 53 years. He married, had children, and became a successful fisherman despite missing most of his left foot. Every winter for the rest of his life, when the first cold winds began to blow, Bjorn would gather his family around their fire and teach them the techniques that had kept him alive during the worst night of his life. But in the mountains of northern Scandinavia, where temperatures still drop to deadly levels and modern technology sometimes fails, there are still families who remember fragments of what their ancestors knew. They understand that survival sometimes requires abandoning the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about human dignity and the preciousness of individual life. When a family member was dying from hypothermia, the others would use knives to make small cuts in their own arms and legs, then press the bleeding wounds against the frozen person's skin. Fresh blood maintains a temperature of 98 degrees for several minutes after leaving the body, and the iron in the blood would help prevent frostbite from spreading. Gerrick Bloodhand survived the winter of 1339 by cutting himself over 300 times during a 4-month period when temperatures never rose above -20 degrees. His family would drain their blood into wooden bowls and pour it over whoever was closest to freezing to death. Fire became so precious that Viking peasants developed techniques for creating heat without burning any fuel. They discovered that human waste would continue generating small amounts of heat through decomposition for up to 3 weeks after leaving the body. So families would collect their feces in clay pots and position these containers around their sleeping areas, using the natural heat from decomposing waste to raise the temperature inside their huts by several degrees. A single pot of fresh human waste could generate enough warmth to prevent a child from freezing to death during the coldest part of the night. Families would rotate responsibility for managing the waste pots, and children were taught to defecate on command when extra heat was needed. Animal companionship took on desperate new meaning during the worst winters. Viking peasants would capture wild animals like wolves, bears, and large birds, then kill them slowly over periods of weeks or months, keeping the animals alive as long as possible to use their body heat. A live wolf pressed against a human body could provide enough warmth to save someone from hypothermia, so families would trap wolves and break their legs to prevent escape, then use the animals as living heaters. Magnus the wolf-keeper kept 12 live wolves in his family's hut during the winter of 1345, rotating them in shifts and pressing each animal against different family members throughout the night. All 7 members of Magnus's family survived that winter, while every other family in their village died from cold. When people begin dying from hypothermia, their bodies release stored energy in a final attempt to generate heat. This process, which modern doctors call paradoxical undressing, would make dying people suddenly feel extremely hot, causing them to remove their clothes and sometimes even try to go outside into the cold. Viking peasants recognized this as a signal that someone was about to die, but they also learned to use this final surge of body heat to save others. When a family member entered the dying phase of hypothermia, the others would pile on top of them, absorbing every degree of heat the dying person's body released. This practice, called death warming, could sometimes generate enough heat to save 2 or 3 other family members, even though it guaranteed the death of the person providing the warmth. Viking peasants discovered that pregnant women generated significantly more body heat than other adults, but they also required more food and were more likely to die during childbirth in freezing conditions. So families would make collective decisions about which women should get pregnant and when, treating reproduction as a survival resource rather than a personal choice. Women who became pregnant during the harvest season would spend the winter months in the center of family sleeping piles, using their pregnancy-generated heat to keep everyone alive. But they were also expected to give birth alone, without assistance, because helping with childbirth would require other family members to leave the warmth pile and potentially freeze to death. Historical records show that 68% of women who gave birth during winter died within a week of delivery, but their babies provided enough extra body heat to increase the survival rate of other family members by 24%. The most successful families developed rotation systems that would seem impossible to modern people. Every member would spend exactly 47 minutes in each position within the warmth pile, timed by counting heartbeats or breathing patterns. The person on the bottom would absorb heat from everyone above them, but would also be slowly crushed by the weight. The person on top would lose heat to the air, but could breathe freely. The people in the middle received heat from above and below, but had to remain perfectly still to avoid disrupting the pile. Children as young as 3 years old learned to wake up automatically after 47 minutes and move to their next position without fully waking the others. Adults could perform the rotations while unconscious, their bodies trained through months of practice to maintain the life-saving rhythm even when their minds were shut down. Tools for survival were created from whatever materials families could find, but the most effective implements were made from human bones. When family members died during winter, the survivors would strip the flesh from the bones and use them to create heating devices. Hollowed-out leg bones made excellent containers for warming urine or blood. Rib bones could be tied together to create scrapers for removing ice from the inside of huts. Finger bones made perfect tools for cutting frozen meat or digging through snow. Ragnar Boneworker created an entire survival kit from his dead father's skeleton during the winter of 1341. He used his father's skull as a bowl for melting snow, the leg bones as containers for storing body heat, and the rib cage as a frame for holding animal skins. The psychological techniques for mental survival were taught to children from the time they could speak. Viking peasant children learned to enter trance-like states where they could slow their heart rates and reduce their need for food and warmth. This wasn't meditation or mysticism. It was practical training for staying alive when resources ran out. The most skilled children could reduce their heart rates to 30 beats per minute and maintain this state for hours at a time, allowing them to survive on a fraction of the calories and heat that would normally be required. The Viking peasants who survived the coldest nights of the year didn't do it through courage or strength or divine intervention. They did it by accepting that survival required them to become something other than human for months at a time, and by developing systems that allowed entire communities to make that transformation together, then return to normal life when the crisis passed. Their story isn't one of heroism or adventure. It's a blueprint for what people are willing to do to each other and to themselves when the alternative is death.